Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know that a lot of you have been interested since we put the promo out last week about this session. So whether you're tuning in live, whether you're catching up on replay, I'm Sally, co-founder of Talent Included. I'm really, really glad you're here. I just wanted to say a huge thank you, Jane, for joining us today. I appreciate how busy you are. So thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Sally.
No problem. So Jane and I met a couple of months ago when I had the pleasure of attending one of Jane's sessions. It was a kind of a good few hour session and we explored mediation. And I walked away from the session thinking, this is the skill that we need in the D&I space. And I think lots of things have happened in our world recently. Very recently, in terms of the tides changing, the scrutiny those are, in D&I are facing in role. There's lots of kind of words being bandied around like kind of lack of capability, which I have to kind of put my hand up and say that I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that narrative. I think there's a real kind of empowerment gap of organizations who have gone out there and said, we need a D&I lead, we need them to come in and kind of, move the dial for us. But when it's actually come to the crux, they haven't empowered them to do that. And so I spend a lot of my time talking to business leaders who are trying to reposition or position inclusion as a real kind of commercial business lever. And I'm also talking to those in the D&I space saying, right, what is it that we need from a skills perspective to be able to make these changes in organizations, to be able to influence, I think, where tensions can be really high, they can feel deeply personal, and the conflict that we're seeing in the world in kind of wider kind of geopolitics at the moment, and how that's kind of manifesting in the workplace. So when I started piecing all this together, I'm like, this is the skill that we need in the D&I space, because we are dealing with potential conflict kind of all day, every day. And how do we move people towards, away from that discomfort, towards clarity, towards connection, and then ultimately towards change? So enter stage left, Jane Gunn. Please tell us a little bit about you and how you have gained the name of the barefooted mediator, which barefooted mediator, which I think that sounds awful. The barefoot mediator. Jane, tell us about your story, because it's fascinating.
I will. Thank you very much, Sally. So yes, I'm a lawyer by training, and I've been working in the legal space for many, many, many years. I started, as many lawyers do, sort of doing a clerical job, and then moved up through the ranks to work at a city firm. And then I sort of thought, hang on a minute, the way the legal profession works, the way we're trained, the way we operate doesn't kind of sit with me. And at that stage, early 1990s, there was a movement to bring mediation, which is a skill that's been around for many, many, many thousands of years, but to bring that into the legal profession and actually to mediate, in particular, legal disputes, but to use this skill. So I was one of the pioneers, if you like. I wasn't a founder of the mediation movement, but I was one of the early adopters of mediation in the early 1990s. And we were all so excited about it at that time. We thought, well, we're going to revolutionize the world. But actually, it's taken quite a long time to catch on. But it has now been adopted by legal firms and by lawyers and by corporations and indeed by the courts. And so it is a mainstream form of resolving disputes, called one of the branches of alternative dispute resolution. However, right from the beginning, I was always excited that there's a window of opportunity, that, before you get to the stage where you need litigation or a complaint or agreements, there's this whole window of opportunity during which time the conflict, whatever, has been escalating. It's been getting worse. What could you have done at the beginning if you'd spotted it earlier? What could you have done during that time that it's escalating? So whilst I've operated as a mediator, mediating endpoint disputes, I've also operated during this and encouraged people to look at this window of opportunity. And I do see it, and we'll cover that later, Sally, as an opportunity. But I've also seen the opportunity, if you like, for people to adopt the skills and tools and mindset of a mediator. So that's what, for me, barefoot mediation means. I am sat here barefoot today, and I have been all for many, you know, when I'm working from home, as we've had to very much more over the last few years, I found it much more comfortable to be barefoot. But then I thought about that, and it became a joke, and it became my nickname. But I've thought about barefoot. The term barefoot doctors, for example, came from in China, where people who lived in the rural communities couldn't get to hospitals and doctors. So they trained up people in their communities to offer sort of first aid, if you like, paramedics, to be barefoot doctors, to offer the basic essential skills. I think the idea of a barefoot mediator is someone who can offer those essential skills and tools, be the go-to person in an organization, the barefoot mediator, or hopefully a whole tribe of barefoot mediators, people who just adopt the principles, mindset, and skills of mediation. And I call them resolutionaries.
I love it. I absolutely love it. I'm so excited about getting, you know, really getting stuck into this, because I know, and I think hopefully, you know, those watching can see the relevance to the world of EDI and the world that we do in that space. But where are you seeing this as a skill that, you know, what are the kind of outside influences, the external forces that you think are really impacting the need and the rise for this as a leadership skill within the workplace?
Well, Sally, as you alluded to at the beginning, there's such a huge amount going on in the world, sort of geopolitically and in every other way. You know, we started off, and why I started off working barefoot is we had a crisis. We had a COVID crisis, and that impacted people hugely. But I believe we now live in this time, which is a cycle of crisis. There are so many things going on. There's external conflicts, you know, global conflicts, wars. There are financial crises. There's just endless cycle of crises that all impact all of us every day. If we choose to watch the media, and I don't watch it very much anymore because it does disturb our equilibrium to be sort of bombarded with 24-hour negative news, but there's so much going on that it is, I believe it's impacting all of us, that we are all being impacted and feeling much more stressed and becoming much more adversarial, because we live in this world where we're sort of bathed in conflict the whole time. And so we need to understand that that's impacting us. It's impacting how we see the world and how we react to things that are going on in our everyday lives, including the workplace.
I think you're right. And I also think that everyone is expected to have an opinion on something. Everyone is expected to have a stance.
Yes.
You know, even if you look at, you know, how the algorithms within kind of social media platforms, the like, if you're looking on YouTube, it's the like or the dislike. You're expected to have an immediate reaction or opinion on something. And I think, and I wonder whether some of this conflict comes from the pressure to have a stance, the pressure to feel a certain way about something, the pressure to then perhaps react to a certain situation. But I also wonder whether there's some of the conflict and the difficult conversations come from not actually potentially being equipped or educated enough to actually have an opinion or have a stance on a particular subject or know how to deal with it. And I wonder whether, you know, are you seeing more that we are actually avoiding these difficult conversations?
We are. So yes, you're right, Sally. There's a pressure to sort of maybe accept a particular narrative or stance, particularly if you're not sure of you haven't done your research, you're not sure what you think. So you may go with the flow or with the sort of current trend, a fear of speaking up, a fear of even questioning. You know, if you've got some questions or thoughts or uncertainties, there's a fear about asking those for fear of upsetting somebody or offending somebody. And so people aren't asking questions, gaining the knowledge and information that they would like, because they fear those conversations and how they'll play out, I think.
Absolutely. And what do you think the cost is of avoiding these difficult conversations?
Well, there's a huge cost, I think. I mean, where it ends up with people feeling uncomfortable or feeling stressed or feeling unsafe, then they may actually take time off work. They may avoid certain colleagues. Perhaps they even resign from an organization, may end up with grievance and complaints if people do have a conversation, but it all goes wrong. So I think there's a huge cost. And, the ultimate cost is one that impacts the culture of the organization. How do we deal with these kind of things around here? And so ultimately, the organization and the culture of the organization depends upon having enough people who are able to have these difficult conversations to enable this dialogue to occur, and therefore for people to feel there's an open space in which they can question and ask.
Which I think is really interesting, because I think that's what we're trying to achieve with the D&I space. It is kind of shared understanding, knowledge sharing, the sharing of lived experiences,
Yes.
and then understanding different points of view. Because, and hopefully we are going to unpack this. It's not necessarily about, everyone agreeing. Oh, hang on. Maybe I'll leave that question, because I know we're going to kind of go apologies. Okay, so then, what does mediation mean every day in work and life? And I really would love to hear your view on this kind of work and life, the connection of the two, because we are essentially the same person. I know you've done a huge amount of work, and tell us about the books that you've written and the titles, because they're captivating in themselves.
Yeah, the first book I wrote was called How to Beat Bedlam in the Boardroom and Boredom in the Bedroom. And the reason I wrote that, Sally, is coming along to a group very much like the one you experienced. And we're talking about workplace disputes and boardroom disputes. And all of a sudden, 2 or 3 people put their hand up and said, yes, but actually, can I apply these skills to a challenge I've got with my teenager at home, for example? And that came up several times. I've got a teenager who won't tidy his bedroom, or smokes too much, or won't study, or all sorts of different challenges. And I said, absolutely. The skills, the tools, the mindset, the principles, they apply whether you're at home, whether you're at work, or whether you're looking at a global conflict. Of course, a global conflict is much more complex. You've got more stakeholders, you've got more people involved, more countries, more individuals, but the principles are exactly the same. And at its heart, the key, the skill of mediation is about understanding and moving beyond people's positions. So I think, I showed you, a diagram where you've got people's positions at the top, but underneath that, there's a whole lot of information that we're not talking about. What are people's needs? What are their fears? What are their interests? What are their concerns? What are their beliefs? What are their values? What drives that position? And when you can dig beneath the surface in having a conversation that says, okay, I've heard your position, Sally. That's very interesting. But why does that matter most to you? What is it about this particular topic that matters most to you? And why do you feel so passionately about your perspective on it? When you can dig underneath and understand where someone's coming from, what matters to them, and not feel that your job is to say, yeah, but I see things differently. Let me just challenge you on that and prove that I'm right. That's the difference.
I think it is. And it's really interesting, when I was in the session doing it live, how you framed that part of the session and what it is that we were trying to achieve, and almost kind of put a framework around it. And then to actually practice it, it felt good. It actually, you're right. It felt like I wasn't in the conversation to win. I was in the conversation to understand.
Yes.
And I think as soon as it was framed like that, it was like almost, okay, the ego can be left at the door. This is actually essentially more, it's more about me listening, but also articulating my point of view, which actually is quite difficult to do. And it's actually quite difficult to do when you feel under pressure, isn't it?
And nobody really wants to know why. And maybe you haven't even had the chance to explore why. Let me dig. So part of what we do in mediation is we dig much deeper. We go and explore and say, well, let's really understand where you're coming from, why you experience what you've experienced, why you think what you think. And that can be quite revealing for the person themselves, because maybe nobody's ever taken the time to enable them to think that deeply. So I say in mediation, we've got to think deeply, differently, and dangerously.
I love that. Absolutely. It even again, like kind of signposting it like that, you know, you're giving someone permission, aren't you, to say, yes, like, it's all right, express how you feel.
Yeah.
I think as well, and I think again, what we see and probably get frustrated at in the D&I world is this kind of paralysis. You know, this may be lack of information, lack of knowledge, lack of confidence, then stalls any kind of progress. How do you feel that mediation kind of can help you move away from kind of paralysis and into progress?
How do you mean in terms of in the organization itself, having a process to follow or
Yeah,
something
absolutely.
like that?
Yeah. In terms of like the essentially the impact that kind of mediation has.
I've been fascinated for a long time with organizations that have adopted the mediation and the mediation approach and made it part of their culture. And I think that's where you need to go to. If you're an organization that feels passionately about this, you know, you need to say, look, we understand that people don't all see things the same way. That isn't what, you know, having a good culture means. It doesn't mean everybody is a clone of everybody else. So there will be challenging conversations as well as grievances and complaints, but having a framework for what's called early dispute resolution or early conflict resolution. So let's catch it early and resolve it simply. Having just that framework, that understanding that there are a few people in the organization who've got these skills who can help you. We empower people to have those conversations and we support people to have those conversations. We train a few people to have those basic skills that they can learn to sort of listen and empathize and resolve. That's where it starts, I think, Sally, rather than the paralysis that you say. Do something positive, create a process, basically, that is there and supports everybody when they need it.
I think it's really interesting because what we're seeing more and more, especially as D&I strategies are becoming under more scrutiny, is that there is a lot more governance around the work that is done. And a prime example of that is comms, you know, communication around or response to something that's going on politically or something that's going on externally. And I wonder whether, you know, this is another opportunity, like you say, to use this as a framework to say, this is how we deal with conflict in this organization.
Absolutely.
This is what an escalation point could look like.
Yes.
But the first thing that we would encourage is that we create an environment where we can have a conversation that is centered around a mediation framework that is going to help resolve X, Y, and Z. And I think that is a really kind of proactive way to just kind of, you know, more widely thinking about workplace culture. We spend so much time at work, don't we? And you're brought in, you know, and you're brought in at the point where organizations go, my goodness, we need a bit of help with this. So are you able to kind of share, and I do this to you every time we meet, I'm like, spill the tea. What's going on in your world, Jane? And I know that you never, ever share, you know, who you're working with. But, you know, I know you never do that. But just in terms of the disputes that you get involved in, because I think that's the bit that is really interesting and fascinates me.
So typically I help boards, partnerships, teams, you know, people, places where people are meeting together, making decisions, having to have dialogue, but it's the decision-making process. Basically, mediation itself is a decision-making process. It's how do you use the skills and tools to decide where we go from here. And teams, boards, and partnerships are making those decisions all the time, but they don't have a framework. So sometimes they get stuck because they disagree about things, or they don't take long enough to make a decision, or they allow or enable a particular person to hold sway or manipulate or influence a decision without putting their hand up and asking the awkward questions to say, I don't agree, or I don't understand. And so it's so a lot of my work is around, you know, where decisions have gone wrong, but also where they could be made more easily if you had a framework for understanding the decision-making process itself. So this particular framework you can use for decisions, for dialogue, for disputes, for finding the right direction. It's a very universal tool, which is why I think mediation, if you call it that, is so important at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, I think that kind of underlying conflict that then can kind of, weave itself into a culture can have such a damaging impact. And also, and almost a way to really kind of stall the business and the business owners and the partnerships and the boards by really striving forward. So have you seen incidents where organizations kind of have embedded this, and then you've kind of revisited them, and you can see that the way they're actually operating as a leadership team have changed and significantly impacted the business on a positive?
Completely different. I do, Sally, although one of the challenges for me is that I often don't see, I often don't see the result. I know that I understand that the result has been better, but hopefully if I do my work well, I'm not invited back.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's changed and got better. If I am invited back, it's maybe, we tried a bit, but we didn't quite make it succeed. But yes, I mean, I'll give you two examples, not of mine, but two of the people who really inspired me early on. One was, and I went to a presentation in the States, and it was a leader of GE. He was their general legal counsel. Both of these people that I met were legal counsel. So they were the lawyers, in-house lawyers, dealing with all the conflicts. And they both went, this is mad. We could put in place this different process. So the first one, and I've got certainly a podcast with one of them, Elpidio Villarreal at GE, he said, really, we need to cascade this approach through our whole organization. Now, that's a big organization to do that. The other colleague of mine, I went to his memorial service, sadly, recently, but he was called Michael Leeds, and he was the general counsel of British American Tobacco. And you can imagine whether you agree with smoking and tobacco or not, but that he had a big job because there would be lots of intellectual property disputes, at least. But again, he was so bowled over by this mediation, and this goes back to in the UK here when it was first coming in, that he again cascaded this approach through the whole organization, and was very, very instrumental in influencing me and just seeing the potential when you can do that. So those are two big organizations who just said, right, we're adopting this approach, we see it, we get it, it'll make a huge difference, and it does, and it did.
Absolutely. And I think as well, feedback is a tool that we all need to kind of, get better at and master in terms of, just engaging staff, engaging your teams. But I want to talk to you about the concept that harmony isn't always the end goal. Can you elaborate on that? Because again, I think there's probably this preconceived idea that if you're going into a mediation, you're going to have to come out and agree on something.
So I think probably the talk that I gave, or the workshop that you came to, was entitled "The Magic of Conflict." And then people said to me, "Oh, why is it magic? People want to." So the challenge is, for most of us, we want to avoid conflict, and we do avoid it. We avoid it. We bury our head. We would rather not have that challenging conversation or raise an issue. I say that conflict is magic. It is the magic ingredient that organizations need, because it's a catalyst for change. So the example I give, and probably gave, Sally, to you, is that conflict is like water. If you've got an organization, if you've got a garden, you never water your garden and it never rains, it just dries up and shrivels up. You've got no growth, nothing new coming up. If, on the other hand, you've got too much water, then your garden is flooded and it's ruined anyway. So we need water. We need our plants to grow. We need our organizations to be green and vibrant. But we need to know that it is going to rain. There are going to be challenges, but we need to welcome them. And we then need to channel them. So with rain, we have an umbrella, we have gutters and rain pipes. We have ways of channeling it. And we know, if it's a light rainstorm, we need the umbrella. If it's a bit heavier, then we need a raincoat as well. We know what to do and where to channel it. So that's exactly the same as having this framework for your organization. You say, this is what happens with a conflict or a challenge. And basically, it's a very simple framework. You say the first thing we need to do is for the two people or people involved, they should sit down and have a conversation with them. They shouldn't just escalate it to a higher authority. They shouldn't just call in their manager. They should have the confidence and the courage, supported by the culture and the organization, to say, let's just have a conversation about this. If that doesn't work, then they should call in maybe a neutral third party, somebody like me or somebody within the organization who's got those skills. But there are steps that you go through. Rather likely the water, there are different ways to channel that conflict that avoid it escalating too quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And you also talk about, and I do want to talk about your framework just in a minute, but I do want to talk about something else that you talk a lot about, which is kind of, what does it mean to stand up for something in today's workplace? And why is that so important?
So one of the key things about mediation is it's principles based.
Okay.
It moves away from positions towards principles. And this comes from one of the early books on the topic, Getting to Yes. Some people will have heard of that, but that moves away from positional bargaining to principle bargaining. That is understanding exactly what we've already discussed. What matters most to people and why does it matter? What are your principles on this? So at its core, you need to understand, what are my principles? Why do those matter most? But going back to what are my individual principles or values? What are the organization principles and values? And if I apply those, what does that mean to how I behave and treat others? How would I treat somebody when we're in conflict? Because I have those principles at heart. And one of the key principles of mediation is, in fact, that people should speak up and say what matters to them. So it is about you deciding, each individual deciding what's important to them, and being able to speak up and say, this is what matters to me. And the difference is to be able to do that in a way that's calm and collaborative rather than adversarial and aggressive. And if you can say what matters to you and stand up for it and do it in that way that's calm and collaborative, this is just a statement of what matters to me, but here's why it matters, rather than becoming adversarial and aggressive and trying to make your point or prove your point. That's the difference.
And I think I do absolutely, if you're thinking about kind of, collaboration, a larger scale in terms of how we need to come together as workers, as employees, to overcome business challenges, to, think about how we're going to fight off the external, disruptors in the market, the competition. We need those skills. We need to be able to collaborate and come together internally. And I wonder whether there's this kind of layer that goes over this, which is all around, and linking back to the D&I world, around how do we create psychological safety so someone can come and say and stand up for something that they believe in. That's
interesting, Sally. I mean, isn't psychological safety about not feeling that you're going to be subject to aggression and adversity because you've said something, or because you behaved in a particular way or dressed in a particular way? So it is that ability to express oneself, but explain where you're coming from or why that matters to you, without having to, and this is the key point, without having to persuade everybody else that they need to adopt the same approach. It's okay to be different, but you don't have to persuade everybody else that they need to be different too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
you have to sort of follow the same narrative, the same approach, but just understand we're all different, but actually to sort of recognize and appreciate that difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And taking it back to, you know, the lessons that we, you know, lessons kind of in parenting life or outside work life, you know, what work do you do with families to kind of to support them through potential, you know, periods of conflict and what we call probably like opting out? You know, people are opting out of social engagements, they're opting out of communicating with their family, and that is avoidance in its probably purest form, isn't it?
I don't do an awful lot of work with family, but I do some. And what I'm noticing, Sally, is a huge challenge with people cancelling, if you like, relationships with relatives, with parents, with children, with best friends, you know, people who've been best friends for, you know, forever. And then all of a sudden there's this, what you might call ghosting or cancelling. And why does that happen? And that's again because there's been a difference of opinion and an inability to have the conversation. I mean, there can be other reasons, but exploring those reasons is important too.
Absolutely. So talk to me about the framework. Talk to me about how you kind of put it together. Obviously, you know, you are an author. You've been working in this space for, you know, 20 odd years. Talk to me about the framework that you took us through on that kind of workshop day, and the impact it's been having.
So, well, there were lots of different bits to that framework, I think, Sally. I mean, I don't know which bit you would like me to talk through. We did look at the sort of, we looked at, one of the things we looked at was how conflict escalates. That's one of the things I feel most people need to understand. So most conflicts escalate really quickly, and they escalate from the point where the conversation breaks down. And so what we tend to do in any crisis or conflict is, first of all, we have a conversation with ourselves in our head and we're thinking, what's going on here? But we make up our own narrative. We make up a story, we make assumptions, we come to judgments, and we make inferences. And then what we do is we gather our support groups. So we go out to our friends and our colleagues and our family, and we may get sort of formal people involved like HR or a legal advisor, and then we form our support groups. Now, if you've got two or more people, they've each got their sort of teams and their groups, and so then those groups have got their own story, their own narrative, and that becomes what I call hardened. You know, that becomes ring fenced, and it's absolutely solid. And there you've got your two different positions. And then the escalation carries on, and there may be threats and actions. But at the bottom, what's really important is that it isn't really about what we said it was about. And in fact, what happened at the top is we haven't explored those narratives. We haven't done the hard work to explore. And so then it becomes fear of losing face. I've now attached myself to that group in that position. I've said that that's what I believe in. I haven't fully explored it, or maybe I have, but maybe there's more to explore. But now I can't step back and lose face. I can't change my mind. I can't understand more, because that would mean losing face. So we stand on the edge of the abyss, and we risk going into the abyss together. And, you know, frankly, that's where we're all at the moment as a society, as we stand on the edge of the abyss, because we've moved into this space where there are so many things that we feel so strongly about that we're not prepared to understand other people's positions on. So we're all standing on the edge of the abyss. And so the work in mediation is to de-escalate. And there's a simple way of doing that. And I'll give you a small mnemonic. I know people like these, but we shift. Basically, we're shifting from fear to love, and it's not as soppy as it sounds. So we're shifting from fear, which is feeling we have to fight, feeling we have to engage, feeling we have to be adversarial, but most of all, feeling we have to be right, to being able to love, for which I mean, have to listen to yourself, listen to others, listen to what they're saying, observe what's actually going on here, dig a bit deeper, verify, check, have I got that right? Did I miss something? Am I making assumptions? Am I making judgments? And then empathize. I see where you're coming from. I understand. So we just make that shift from fear to love. from jumping to conclusions, from what we tend to do when we disagree with someone else, and we very quickly do this, is we demonize them. And I give the example, which is a very simple example, is if I drive down to the village now and somebody cuts me up at the crossroads, which often happens, and I start shouting and shaking my fists, I've already gone into aggressive adversarial mode. Then I look harder into the car and I go, oh, that's Mary from next door. I love Mary, actually. I've immediately forgiven her. But in the first instance, I've demonized Mary because I didn't know it was her, and I just got angry and aggressive. But then we need to rehumanize. This is all about coming back to humanity and understanding what matters most is how we rehumanize. And of course, with technology and with emails and with AI and everything, we are dehumanizing each other much more quickly. And so coming back to what does it mean to rehumanize, to come back to humanity and stand up for humanity, this is the key. So I say we need the 3 hums in the work that I do. We need humor, humanity, and humility.
It's fantastic. And it's just, yeah, I love it. It's so relatable. And I'm really thrilled, Jane, that you're going to be running a session for us later on this year. We've got a date set in September.
Yes.
We have got some space in central London. We're going to keep it to around 20 people to try and keep it as, as intimate as possible. And having kind of gone through the session myself, it was just such an eye-opener in terms of the skills that we need as leaders, as inclusive leaders, which I think is a skill that everyone is trying to kind of strive towards, to be able to navigate their way through a very complex and challenging time at the moment for any organization. We need to, going back to that kind of the human element of what you talk about, we need to put our people front and center. And the impact, wider society is having on the human race, how we all show up and how we all react, I think it's going to continue, sadly, to become polarized. I think the work that we need to do in workplaces is to create that harmony, to be able to innovate and drive business performance through people. And so I think these are skills that we all need. So if anyone would like to be involved in that session, please do drop me. I know there's a couple of spaces have gone already, but yeah, drop me a note and I can send all the details over. But have you got any kind of parting pearls of wisdom, Jen? I literally could talk to you all day, all day. Have you got any kind of parting, pearls of wisdom in terms of how we can show up and kind of flex our mediation skills as leaders today in the workplace?
I think I just finish with the sort of, I've got a couple of mantras. Whatever is unspoken is hardest to change, and we speak least about the things that matter most. And so I think the sort of being willing to have the conversation, but more than anything, just being willing to listen, to learn. I've got 4 principles, actually. I'll just finish with those. Listen, learn, love, and laugh. And laughter is, it's that humor. It doesn't have to be about making jokes or making fun of someone else, but just bringing that humor back into our lives, I think, is really important. So listen, learn, love, and laugh. That's what I'd say.
Oh, what a perfect way to end the session. Thank you so much. Jane has obviously tagged in all of this content, so please go and follow. I would urge you to sign up to her newsletter because it is like a nugget of leadership insight and how to show up in the world. So please do subscribe to that. And then, we'll drop a link on here as to how you can get involved in our session that's going to be held in September in central London. And we look forward to seeing you there. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Sally.
See you soon. Take care. Bye.